Thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium, Session 172, titled Pastoral Hope for Spiritual Abuse. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for approximately 3 months, beginning the end of August 2020. This session will have a question and answer period at the end. Please type your questions into the Whova app to be addressed during that time. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation, the name of God should never be invoked to coerce, shame, or frighten people into compliance. Yet, in a culture of worthiness, interviews, and high demand religious expectations, this is an experience that is far too frequent. In this session, Gina, Colvin, and Kate Langston, seminarians and ministers, will explore how spiritual abuse damages a person's relationship with the divine, how folks in high demand religious systems can recognize and set healthy boundaries, and what appropriate pastoral care looks and feels like. I'll take a second to introduce you to our speakers before we begin. Katie Langston is a doubter by nature and a believer by grace. She grew up in a Mormon Cache Valley, Utah, and still isn't sure she fits in anywhere sophisticated enough to have a target. Several years ago, Katie converted to Orthodox Christianity and is now the intern pastor of a small congregation in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She works as the director of digital strategy at Lutheran Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. In her first book, Sealed, a memoir of family and faith, will be published by Thornbush Press in 2021. Dr. Gina Colvin engages conversations about the spiritual and religious life on the other side of extreme orthodoxy. Her guests are faith leaders, theologians, creatives, thinkers, and survivors of religious fundamentalism. Gina is a New Zealand Maori who grew up as a Mormon. She currently worships locally with the Anglican Church and internationally with Community of Christ. Gina and her Mormon husband Nathan are parents of 1 agnostic, 1 practicing Pentecostal, and 4 mostly Anglican, periodically Community of Christ, but sometimes Mormon sons who quite like Buddhism. And now I will give the floor to our presenters.
Hey,
everybody. Anglican.
Yes.
Thanks, Anne.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. How's that?
You're starting to share it. There we go.
Everyone see?
Katie, you might be sharing the wrong screen. We see your slides.
Awkward. Let's see. There we go.
No more awkward than mispronouncing words. Thank you, ladies.
All right, how's that? We're good? Awesome. Very good. Well, welcome everyone. We are excited to be here and delighted to share some thoughts with you. Just want to say hey and find out maybe a little bit about who you are and where you're from. So if you want to use the chat or the Whova app, I don't know if there's one or the other that's more appropriate, probably the Whova app. Just kind of let us know where you're from and where you're tuning in from. I'm in Wisconsin today. Gina is in New Zealand, so this is truly an international situation we have going on. I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going today. First up, Gina and I are going to kind of tag team, go back and forth. First up, we're going to do just a grounding practice called Lectio Divina, or dwelling in the Word. It's an opportunity to take a passage of Scripture and to really reflect on it, and dwell in it and meditate in it. And then the rest of the outline is as follows. We'll talk about defining spiritual abuse, disorganized attachment. Gina will talk about out of the magic. I'll talk about pastoral theology. Gina will talk about pastoral approaches, and then we'll have a Q&A. And we hope to have enough opportunity here to sort of lay the groundwork and the framework for a conversation, and to be able to answer questions and talk with you about your experiences and anything that might have piqued your curiosity in the presentation. So without any further ado, I just want to invite you for a minute to dwell in this passage from the Gospel of Luke. And so I'll allow just a moment of silence and invite you to breathe in and breathe out the presence of mercy and love and wholeness. And listen to this scripture. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up immediately behind him, meaning Jesus, and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out of me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, faith has healed you. Go in peace." And now, if this were an in-person gathering, what I would probably have you do is turn to a relatively friendly-looking stranger sitting next to you and maybe share a little bit about what came up for you as you heard that. I think that's kind of laborious to do through chat, so unfortunately we won't do that as a group. But I do invite you to reflect and maybe write down something that grabbed you out of that passage. And I've sprung on Gina that I'm going to ask her as well to kind of share and reflect what caught her in the passage, and then I'll share a couple things that really struck me this time through it. So, Gina, what did you hear in that text?
Katie, what stood out for me was the phrase, "Who touched me?"
What about that stood out to you?
Well, it causes me to reflect on this idea of, in this, that we're often being touched by somebody, like somebody's story touches us. There is an immediate invitation, I think, there to respond to the way that that person touched. Maybe it's their story of suffering or grief or joy. I mean, as a parent of a lot of boys, they're always touching me. And, in my heart, my soul, but also physically. And the question is, how do I respond to that? So it's a lovely invitation, I feel.
Thank you. That's beautiful. You know what? There were a couple things that sort of, struck me this time. One was no one could heal her. And I think that's something that I have felt in my life, like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm in such a state. Is healing even possible? And then the statement, your faith has healed you, go in peace, just because I think faith in our context so often gets mistaken for certainty, or it gets mistaken for the mental assent to a certain list of propositions, but what it really means is trust. And I'm just struck, you know, that Jesus, that she trusted Jesus because Jesus was trustworthy. And then in that exchange of trust, the way that he responded with mutuality and care to her touching him, right? The way that he responded created healing in her body of something that she'd been unable to heal for a really long time. And so that just really moved me, that image of trust as healing. Because I think where we often go wrong when we're talking about, you know, spiritual abuse and so on is in trust that gets betrayed. So,
Katie, can I ask you a question?
yeah.
Do you believe that literally that this happened?
Oh my gosh, Gina, this is such a
It's just a question, isn't it?
Do I believe that this literally happened? Yeah, I do.
Okay, I expected as much, and I don't. And so I think this is an invitation to say, okay, so what can we metaphorically or allegorically take out of this?
Mm-hmm.
Or if this is a literally true story, how does this embolden your faith?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we're going to see different things, right?
Yeah, but I think that the literality of it is less important for me than what it communicates about God. That what it shows is an inbreaking of healing by God. My faith is not based on the, I believe in a God who could do this. Maybe I'll put it that way. I believe in a God who could do this and a God who does do this. And did it happen? And, you know, did in exactly this thing happen? I don't know that for sure, but certainly I believe that God could and would do this.
Indeed, right. And I look at it more as an incarnational sort of message to say that we each can respond to the touch of another human being and that we can actually give healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So see how cool we are about like balancing that out.
I know we both have, Gina and I have been in dialogue around these sorts of things for years. And so there's, and we both have a different approach to our faith and how we've made sense of things. And I think it's really important to model that difference, right? That we love each other and laugh at each other and respect each other. And even as we disagree with one another on,
Indeed.
Some things. So anyway.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, so let's talk about defining spiritual abuse. And I know Wendy has asked that question on the Hoover thingy app. And look, there's a lot of question. There is a lot of definitional kind of crisis about how to actually narrow this down. But I have taken this definition from Gina from the Spiritual Growth Ministries. It's a spiritual director's program in New Zealand. And so she says all the definitions of spiritual abuse in the literature involve the use of power or authority to manipulate and control. The authority is often a leader or a system. And I think that's really important to note that it's not just one person. Often it can be a whole procedural and systematic culture, such as a set of beliefs or a way of doing things, which doesn't allow for individual freedom. And I think I want to underscore that word freedom, that good pastoral care and spiritual care of a human being is to allow for a person's individual freedom and their own expression of the divine. And that should never be questioned in a responsible and healthy spiritual system. Richard Gooley uses Rollo May's continuum of power to illustrate how power can be used to control and dominate, but it can also be used to liberate and empower others. Quote, the moral challenge is to see that in our interactions with others, the right use of power moves away from dominating others through exploitation and manipulation, and that it moves towards liberating others through nutrient and integrative acts of power. In spiritual abuse, power is exercised in ways which restrict rather than develop another's freedom. And so I think the way that we are going to understand spiritual abuse is that it affects our ability to trust in any form of spirituality. Okay, let's go to the next one. And I want to just separate this definition of spiritual abuse out from other forms of abuse that occur in these contexts. So if we can just move on to the next slide.
Oh, oops, yep, here we go.
So these are interlocking forms of abuse. So religious abuse I'd like to define, and it's not exclusive to spiritual abuse. So I think you'll recognize that immediately. Religious abuse are the systems, social and familial, the social, familial, doctrinal related dynamics that cause a person humiliation, a lack of belonging, social shunning, confusion, and shame. And what comes to mind there are doctrines on LGBTQ things, doctrines on race, doctrines on women, and it highly affects a person's identity and their belonging. So this is where everybody where the whole religious system begins to operate to shut down a person's expression of identity. It affects their sense of belonging, and that it seems to be kind of an unspoken ritual of shunning. Ecclesiastical abuse, on the other hand, I got this from the Mormon Alliance website. That's the organization, I think at that time was run by Lavina Fielding Anderson. And she says, ecclesiastical abuse occurs when a church officer acting in his official capacity and using the weight of his, less frequently her, office, coerces compliance, imposes his personal opinions as church doctrine or policy, or resorts to such power plays as threats, intimidation, and punishment to ensure that his views prevail in a conflict of opinions. And this affects and causes us to question our personal, internal, and spiritual authority. So if we could go back, and I'll just give a couple of examples, flying off the seat of my pants here. Spiritual abuse, can we just go back to the previous slide there, Katie? Oh, thank you. Affects our ability to trust in any form of spirituality, and really it's about questioning or bringing into question somebody's individual freedom. For instance, I have on, some of you may know that I was pulled into a church discipline for the expression of my individual freedom. I said, no, I can't possibly affirm that I know that Russell Nelson is a prophet of God. I shall not be kind of restricted from expressing my spirituality, my spiritual life, the way I feel that I want to. I want to be part of the body of Christ, so I've received confirmation in the Anglican Church. And that really bothered my local church leader. So that's, and had I not been, what do I call it? Katie, what do I call, had I not been so given to rebellion, I guess, and resistance, I probably would have started to think about my, to trust in my own spiritual authority. I absolutely knew those things were the right thing for me to do, and orientations for me to take, and I wasn't going to be knocked back. But I know that some people find themselves questioning their own spiritual momentum and their own spiritual journey because authority figures are putting a question mark over our freedom or our desire to move in a particular way. And if we go back forward one, and religious abuse, I think, occurs in a discursive way. In other words, it's a quietly happening kind of procedural, agreed procedural way. So for instance, let's take the testimony meeting, and there is an agreed tone one takes, there's agreed words that one must assume, and affirmations that one must make. Now you can ramble a little bit about, maybe a travel money or whatever it is, or something happened at the shop the other day, and wow, it was a cool spiritual experience. But the expectation is you're going to affirm something, and everybody agrees. Now, if you don't affirm that thing, there will be some kind of consequence, some kind of questioning of your status and some kind of quiet questioning of your role. So for instance, I got up one day in a testimony meeting and I said, look, I can't say I believe any of this, but I can say that while I'm choosing to believe, like these really nice things happening, particularly in my community. And then somebody got up and said, well, I can say that I do believe it all. And he was thumping the podium at the same time. And that was quite sort of, that's an example of religious abuse. It's like nothing necessarily has to happen to alert it. There's no kind of alert level, but there's an agreed sense in the community that one hasn't behaved in a particular, in the way that's expected, and they'll respond kind of almost discursively and kind of instinctually. Ecclesiastical abuse, I mean, I've been reasonably fortunate, except for the awful incident of being called into a church discipline. I've been reasonably fortunate that ecclesiastical abuse and one-on-ones with church leaders haven't happened very much, except I did have a situation in which I was having a temple recommend interview, and the person interviewing me said, look, I hear you talk about Jesus quite a bit, but I don't really hear you discuss President Monson or be a testimony of him. And then he said, would you be a testimony of him? And I said, well, sure. Like, I don't think I haven't got any evidence that he says anything, prophesies anything or reveals anything, but I'm all in favor if he does. And at which point my temple recommend was removed from me. So Katie's laughing up there. But, you know, the effect of this, the ecclesiastical abuse is intended to affect our sense of personal authority. We're supposed to outsource our spiritual authority to another figure. Okay, do we have any questions? Where do we find these questions?
They're in the app, which I don't have because I'm
cheap.
Let me help you. They're in the app.
Yep.
One person says here, let's see, I feel that the mainstream LDS church does a great job for children and people new to the church. How have you navigated teaching your children to accept God, yet not fall into the traps of orthodoxy so they don't suffer pastoral abuse?
Should we hold, that seems more like a broader question versus this, like a particular thing. Maybe we could hold, that's a great question
for later.
Want to get to it.
Is there anything about this? Can you see, Anne? Is there anything
about the type of abuse? I need a clear definition of spiritual abuse and examples of it.
Okay, so are we good there, Wendy? I don't know how you respond to us because we can't see you. I hope we're good. Just put a follow-up question if you're still confused about that.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Move on.
Yeah, moving on. So I'm going to share some insights that I in one of my semesters in seminary, I took an independent study with our pastoral care professor on spiritual abuse, and ended up reading a book that was really, really helpful to me called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexandra Stein. And this was a book about abuse in high demand cultures. And the ways in which high demand, or what the author of this book calls totalizing systems, ends up harming folks. And she looks at it, she approaches it from an attachment theory lens, which I don't pretend to be an expert on attachment theory or a psychologist or anything like that. But what she talked about resonated really deeply with me in my own experience. So I'll go through a couple of these points and then maybe elaborate on a couple of them. But first is that the notion of a disorganized attachment is so we have attachment figures. You know, the first ones are our parents, our spouses or our significant others, and also we have attachment relationships with close friends, with people who have some level of authority over us, such as especially pastoral authority, right? The kind of spiritual authority, people that we give spiritual authority to. And a disorganized attachment is when the source of the bond, or the source to which you're supposed to turn for comfort and reassurance. You think of a little toddler falling down and running to mom to get comforted before they, in a healthy attachment, then run back out and play, right? So there's sort of there's a tethering to the attachment figure that you turn to that person for, or that source for encouragement and comfort and reassurance that you're okay, especially when you've been harmed. And then you can go back out in a healthy attachment, then you can go back out and there can be distance, and you're not codependent with that person. You're not constantly anxious for their approval or disconnected from them, right? So disorganized attachment is when the source of bond is also the source of harm. So the source that is causing you the harm to which you would turn to an attachment figure to be reassured is the same, which creates an irresolvable paradox. And that does some messed up stuff to your mind and to your emotion and to your spirit. This is something that is present in abusive relationships of all kinds. And so it can be on a micro level between, a parent and a child, or in any kind of relationship, a significant other, a friend, what have you. And it can be present in a macro kind of systemic way. And so there are high demand groups, and sometimes they're colloquially called cults, right? But then there are also political movements that can be this way. There are some folks point to like North Korea as a sort of totalizing nation. And so this sort of disorganized attachment can occur on an interpersonal level all the way up to a systemic level. And what totalizing groups do then, when you begin to deal with not just one-on-one, but begin to look at it at a more macro scale, is that totalizing groups begin to take over appropriate attachments, such that the relationship that you might have with a parent gets overridden by the relationship with the group. So I think about this in my own youth growing up. Had some really negative and abusive experiences with worthiness interviews. Had some significant anxiety around worthiness and questioning my own acceptability in the eyes of God. And my mother would assure me and reassure me that I was okay when I would be compulsively anxious. But I would not believe it until I heard it from a bishop. And I would continually go back, and this was compulsive behavior, but I would continually go back to confessions and worthiness interviews and things like that, seeking reassurance, because it wasn't enough for me to get it from my mother. I didn't trust her enough because the group had taken over that appropriate attachment. And so that's a warning sign. That's something to look out for in these sorts of systems. The results of having disorganized attachment, particularly in a really important area of your life, is that you begin to, the irresolvable paradox begins to create a sense of internal fracture because the pressure is so great. There's dissociation at times, feeling of not quite being within your own body, not quite being able to understand who you are as a self, or to feel okay with yourself. There is compliance begins to come into effect, where you begin to feel as if you must do what the group expects or demands of you in order to remain acceptable, in order to receive the reassurance from the group. And kind of the most insidious, and I think for me, kind of terrifying result is thought policing. And not just thought policing others, which happens, but also yourself. There are things that become unthinkable. But you can't even go there in your own mind. You can't ask that question. You can't say that thing. You can't admit to yourself that you think or wonder something. And I think anytime you're beginning to say to yourself, I'm not allowed to think that thought, right? And that's a red flag, right? That you can't question the source of harm because it's the source you're turning to for comfort. And as a result, you begin to monitor and police the thoughts inside, the very thoughts inside your mind. And then certainly do so in others, because if someone else is to bring up the question that you have, Gina, if someone is to stand up in testimony meeting and be like, I don't know about this, you know, that's a forbidden thought. You're not allowed to say that thing. And so they have to get up and correct you, right? Because you've said the thing that can't be thought. Yeah, you're on mute. There you go.
I appreciate that, Katie, because it looks at the constitution of our attachments in religiously high demand religious organizations. I think it's useful to know how community can be managed. And we won't go into the reasons for why people begin to disaffiliate, because there are many and multiple. It could be for different reasons. At one point, and I guess this is why we're here, you personally have had what I would call an assumptive worldview collapse for whatever reason. That is, all the assumptions that you had caught up in your worldview have flopped over, have disintegrated and deconstructed. And this often not because you had willed it to be that way, but because of a confluence of different dynamics, you've come head to head with the assumptions that you have made about the way the world works. And I've entitled this segment Out of the Magic, and I'm borrowing a lot from E. Marshall Brooks' work on disenchanted lives. He did a wonderful psychosocial ethnography of the experience of former Mormons. And I think it's one of the most important contributions to understanding the way that Mormon folk become disenchanted. And I want to talk about enchantment. Enchantment is an enchanted worldview, particularly in the LDS Mormon experience, is where everything is seen through a magical and folkloric sheen. And that means that there is an answer for everything. There's a kind of a superstition involved. Like, for instance, if I said a swear word, then you might think to yourself, something really bad is going to happen to me. So there's this kind of superstition involved in all of the everyday calculations. So one stays marooned in this enchanted worldview, and stepping out of it in that folklorish sort of magical thing superstitiously invites all of these consequences. For instance, if I'm not wearing my garments, perhaps I'm going to be seduced by somebody, or if I break the word of wisdom, maybe I'm going to get cancer and die tomorrow, and everybody say, that's because.
Yes.
These really, really fantastical calculations that we have been raised and constituted within. And so that's for us to understand that there is a peculiarity, I think, to the Mormon experience, because it is, as Katie said, it's a totalizing worldview. But when a faith crisis happens, I want to say the next thing is that worldview, and I don't mean to be mean, but it's quite implausible. And it's so implausible that it's quite fragile. And so within this totalizing world view system, this assumptive world view system, you have to have attached to it strict social agreements, and they have to be reinforced continually. And as Katie was saying, asking questions of our assumptive worldview is absolutely not allowed. And that I would argue is a form of spiritual abuse, because that sort of abstract, enchanted worldview, I think when we're looking at the literature about adult development, it really doesn't, the enchanted worldview doesn't properly take account of the lifespan of an adult, and that in that lifespan and that development of an adult, there are different phases that one goes through, developmentally appropriate phases that one goes through, like it's a journey, and a kind of a nubile journey. And so in many respects, it kind of maroons people in this fantastical world where you are required to shut the rest of the world down, and your only reference point then becomes the church. That's all very well, and some people are going to live happily with that for the entirety of their lives. Now, I imagine most of us are here because it didn't work. And eventually, that for some people, that fragility will become more dominant, and you'll experience, or many of us have experienced, that assumptive world collapse. And what I really want to talk about is what happens when the magic goes. We can talk about faith development, but I think what Marshall Brooks, I don't even know that's his name, it might be Edward, but he calls himself E. Marshall Brooks, which is a very Mormon thing to do. But anyway, Dr. Brooks is really interested in the ephemeral kind of experience of what happens within the totality of that world collapse. And this is, now I'm going to point towards pastoral care, because when the magic goes and the enchantment wears off and you become disenchanted, it's almost as if the whole sheen of magic and loveliness and this whole kind of world of abstract notions and eschatological futures and this very elaborate cosmology, Mormon cosmology, like the very experience of walking out and seeing a beautiful scenery and being able to say, thank you, God, for such a wonderful experience. Thank you for creating this world for me. You're deprived of, momentarily deprived of. You go spiritually offline. There's experience of anger or flatness and listeness. Like, what is a relationship with my husband if it's no longer sealed in the temple? Who are my parents if I won't, my deceased parents, if I now no longer will see them in the afterlife? What is the point of all this if I'm not going to go to the celestial kingdom and be exalted? These are huge questions that we have to ask ourselves. Like, how do I live now in a world in which I now no longer see the world superstitiously or magically or bending towards me, and God is in personal relationship with me? And I want to, there are a couple of experiences I think are quite ubiquitous. It's the idea of praying about life direction. Now, I'm not going to argue whether or not you have actually received an answer, but there is an intense comfort that comes from feeling as if you have prayed about something and you go forward and you have that confidence that the heavens are behind you. And it gives Mormons this immense kind of confidence, right? And imagine that being taken from you, this existential wasteland. There aren't heavenly beings around you anymore. And that is a very difficult, and I'm laboring this because I think that is the point of pastoral care. How do we look after people properly when the magic has gone, when they are deeply disenchanted? And I do this because I'm not sure, and I'm going to call this out a little bit, and I know, and I'm guilty of it too, is this tendency to revisit the trauma, to deal with the flatness, because it's almost as if the kind of outrage becomes a replacement for the magic. We want those intense feelings. We're addicted in some ways, spiritually addicted to some ways, to feeling intensely about things. And I think there's a kind of a beauty in the ability to feel intensely about things, and to rename our trauma and our outrage for this kind of assumptive world collapse and this kind of strange magical view that we feel hoodwinked into for the whole of our lives. But I suppose what I'd like to say is that there is another way. We can be in this nothingness and it still be a place of deep richness and productivity, spiritual productivity. It might not resonate as a spiritual thing, but certainly the emptiness, the sense of dead space is understood in, I suppose, in the Christian, even in the Buddhist theological tradition, as being developmentally necessary and appropriate. And I think for those who are health counsellors, mental health counsellors and clinicians, it's really helpful to see this as a trauma or a grief of some kind and to treat it that way. Okay. The next slide. I think I'm still going. Sorry about that, folks. Blah, blah, blah.
I think it's me.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow, that thing about the anger and the emotion feeling like replacing the magic, that was really insightful. I mean, think about that for a long time. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about pastoral theology, and I want to emphasize that a pastoral caregiver has to first be grounded in her own theological framework in order to be present with others. So what I share here is mine. And each person who is providing pastoral care, I think, has to do the work, the theological work themselves to come to a place of groundedness in order to be listening to and hearing and responding to folks out of a healed space and a wide space, as opposed to their own shit, you know. And so I don't share this as prescriptive. This is the right pastoral theology. Instead, I share this is my pastoral theology. This is how, when I am listening to folks who are struggling and hearing folks who are struggling, these are the things that ground me in order to hopefully open space for conversation and for healing to happen, and for, in the language I would use, for the Holy Spirit to move. And so the first thing for me is that God's love is big and wide enough to handle trauma. And I think that Gina was really right to name it trauma, because it is trauma. Folks who have experienced abuse in the name of God, that is a really, really tricky thing to untangle. And so there can be a tendency to want to solve it for people, to fix it for people, to try to restore God's good name or whatever it is. Instead, it's okay to just just acknowledge and to sit with the truth of someone's pain, and that it's not up to me to defend God to them. If they're mad at God, they should be mad at God. That's legitimate. If they're not sure if they even believe in God anymore because of what's happened to them, that's legitimate. I don't have to fix it for them or get them thinking the right things. God's love is big and wide enough to handle where they are. A second touch point for me, really as a Lutheran in particular, is the cross. And this is a symbol that can be quite fraught, a theological image and symbol that can be quite fraught. As Mormons, we actually don't really think about the cross very much. We're kind of repulsed by how grotesque it is. This sort of notion of, we don't have crosses because we have the living Christ, not the dead one, right? But for me, as I've worked through my own spiritual trauma and experiences of spiritual abuse, the cross has actually been profoundly transformative in my life as I've recognized it as God's solidarity in experiences of abuse and violence. That Jesus wanted, God wanted so much to know us and to experience what humanity experiences, that God emptied God's self of the privilege of being God in order to experience the lowest of the low of the human experience. And for me, there's an element of beauty in that God's love, again, is deep and wide enough to handle trauma, because God himself, in Jesus Christ, experienced trauma. And so those sorts of touch points ground me and allow me to face what is real, right? As a pastoral caregiver, those sorts of things allow me to say, okay, whatever is real here is okay. And then hopefully then to provide a ministry of presence, simply of seeing and hearing what someone is saying, to open space for someone to speak unthinkable thoughts, right? If we've talked about policing one's own thoughts as sort of one of the hallmarks of someone who's been through a spiritual trauma or a high demand system, showing people you're not gonna freak out when they say a thing that's taboo, right? That it's okay. You can say that thing. That doesn't affect our relationship. That doesn't affect the love I have for you or the confidence that I have in God's love for you. Such that there is a presence of unconditional love. The other that, again, as a pastor and as someone who has been on the receiving end of this, to hear again and again a reassurance of forgiveness, acceptance, and grace. That's something, personally, as I've shared, I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of sense of never being acceptable to God. And so a lot of shame. And so to be able to hear someone share something that they felt they couldn't share, something that they felt they couldn't say, that the shame and the fear around that, and being able to say, here you are, and in this moment, you are accepted and you're loved. If you've done something wrong, you're forgiven. And there's no conditions, no questions, no exceptions, no interviews, right? That this is simply reality, that you are already loved, you're already okay, exactly as you are. For me, those are the sorts of theological and pastoral touch points that hopefully allow someone who's had a disorganized attachment experience to feel and experience a positive attachment in the realm of a spiritual or religious leader. And there's something about that, at least in my experience, is very healing. you know, that I have in particular, I have a very dear friend and mentor who was my professor in seminary, who did this for me. That when I came confused and upset and angry and frustrated and terrified, sat with me and taught me, and by the way that she treated me, that I was okay, that I was loved, that I was forgiven, and that I was free. And so I've experienced that sort of healing relationship in a pastoral care type setting, and hope as well then as a pastoral caregiver to be able to approach these conversations and these difficult traumas with that same sort of space and grace. So that is my slide. Your turn.
Thank you, Katie. Beautiful. I want to talk about 3 different pastoral care contexts in which I found myself. One was when I was a Sunday school teacher, a teen Sunday school teacher at church, and I don't know what had happened. I was in a dudgeon, and I decided at that point, just before teaching the class, that I couldn't stand it anymore, and I thought, I'm going to go find God somewhere else today. And I remember my class saying, where are you going? I said, I'm going off to find God, which was quite rude, but I did it anyway. And I ended up at St. Augustine's Anglican Church, a beautiful old colonial church. It was just gorgeous, and the meeting was stunning, and the music was lovely, and it was just, you know, I was in that space of having to find a new imagination for the divine, and it was here that I was kind of led to. And the assistant vicar saw me sitting in the pew, and I must have looked tormented, because after the meeting finished, he came to me and he goes, you seem sad. Would you like to talk? And I was like, yeah, I would like to. So anyway, he invited me into a pastoral care situation, and it was lovely to start with. And then I mentioned the word Mormon, and at which point he used that opportunity to tell me, as if I didn't already know, that the Mormon church had problems and Joseph Smith had problems. So this is to say that this was an unsuccessful pastoral care context. And if you are not Mormon and you are looking after people who are Mormon, it's not an opportunity for you to find a friend to talk about how awful the Mormon church is, or even how great the Mormon church is. A second pastoral care context I had was my Anglican vicar said, why don't you go and see Sister Kath? Sister Kath is a Roman Catholic spiritual director, and she's a really formidable feminist in the Roman Catholic tradition. She was the perfect person for me, and she was wonderful, and she just sat with me, listened to my story, and she wasn't listening for the logic I was making. She was listening to the spirit that I was emitting. You know, what was I angry? You know, was I being courageous? And then she came to see how grief-stricken I was about losing my faith and my community, and she acknowledged that with immense grace, and it was really, really important. The third pastoral care context was with Richard James, who's an apostle in Community of Christ, who saw in my developing, my reconstructing spiritual life, that at this time I didn't want to leave out my Maori traditions. He saw that as a man who's Welsh, and who has his own kind of Celtic spirituality, and we met in that space of being able to share our paganism and our animism, but you know, just the love that we had and the sacredness that we found in the earth. So he was a really important part of my reconstruction. So pastoral care is utterly and absolutely important. And I want to say, in the situation of spiritual abuse, you need, and you're giving pastoral care to people who have been spiritually abused, and they're not acknowledging that they have been spiritually abused. Maybe, and this is not scientific at this point, you need to differentiate where that person is on their journey. So are they in the process of initial deconstruction? Are they at that point trying to untangle themselves and find a place outside of the bubble of that magical worldview? Are they in that situation? Are they in that disenchanted, that empty situation. It's unlikely if a person is in emptiness and numbness that they're going to seek out pastoral care, because it's at that stage they're like, I don't have anything to do with anyone. But if they do acknowledge that this is a thing, it's a powerful and possibly very, very depleting stage in one's journey. There are those who are wanting to come back online, spiritually online. They're missing their first naivete. Perhaps they want a second naivete. And you see on the message boards and on Facebook a lot, like, I wish I could just forget that this has been awful, that I've deconstructed, and then just go back to that first naivete. And so, but they also acknowledge that they did have a spiritual life and they miss it profoundly. And they're wanting to kind of re-enter that, but it's going to be tricky now because everything has a question mark over it. And there are those who kind of are like, they've been through the wilderness. They acknowledge that they did have a healthy relationship and acceptance that maybe, their life is going to be richer with something spiritual, and they're looking at reconstructing. And so they're going to you to say, what about this idea of God? What about this idea of Jesus, or whatever it is, Former Mormons have this huge, and I say this anecdotally, a tendency to be attracted to Buddhism because it doesn't ask anything in terms of belief. It's almost like a cliche, actually. Oh, yes, you're a former Mormon, sort of secular Buddhist. Well, welcome to everybody else's world. But I think there's, something really instructive about that, because Mormonism has created about 1,000 too many tests of fellowship, which are around belief and agreement. And so when it comes to reconstruction, I think that a lot of former Mormons are rightly allergic to being asked to affirm a belief system. And so they'll many run away from it. Or it will take them a long time to trust in a system, another system, because they've got to pick apart everything. The word Jesus, the word God, the word scripture has to be reinterpreted. Because, anyway. So I want to offer a pastoral care approach with that in mind, that different people are at different stages, and to be mindful about what stage they're at. But my experience has been that a responsible pastoral care approach for former Mormons is about letting go. It's not about replacement. You're not there to replace their understandings. You're there as they wish to help them let go of the things and the ideas and the worldview, the parts and the fragments of these worldviews that will continue to linger unless you give them a healthy permission and do the work with them as they need to let go. The big one is God, the idea of one's God image. We'll talk about that in a second. But so in a pastoral care situation, it's really important to understand that these basic spiritual disciplines and practices may be enmeshed with the abusive system. And be really careful to use, to gain permission to use prayer, to do Bible readings, etc. And explore other ways to create a spiritually safe environment. So it might be at the beginning that people don't want to talk about spiritual things, but they really do, but they don't want to. Like, they're quite aggravated by it, but have a sense that that's part of where they're going, but so don't hurry it. Let them take their own time. And as I say, be very careful using God language. When Mormons hear the word God, it's a very fixed notion of God. And God gets misinterpreted as the church, as the priesthood, as the leaders, as all of these things. Convincing Mormons, it's really hard, that the idea of God can actually exist outside of their these very circumscribed views of the divine. And it might be helpful to use other language, such as the divine, the oneness, the unity, or whatever it is. Most importantly, it's important to encourage those who've come to you for pastoral care to listen to their own inner thoughts and feelings, and help them to question what they've been taught in God's name. I think that's a really important part of the process. Once again, don't hurry it. I think it will automatically happen. And also to create rituals of letting go as needed. And it could be just to go outside with a little tin can and writing people's idea, like having people write down some kind of grief that they've had and just sort of burning it away, or finding ways that really resonate with that person to allow them to let these things go and to mark that moment as they're ready. And we go to the next one, Katie. Oh, okay. I think we're missing one. Oh, can we go back to Katie? I'll just get going as Katie's going back, because I think, yeah, that's right. And as Katie said, provide a really loving and safe environment. I think this is really important, and you'll know this when I say it, but assure them that you're not out to recruit them. If you are coming from a particular tradition, you're not, this isn't about recruitment. You need to assure them constantly that you have no conflicts of religious interest, that your care for them in that space is not about getting them to be a member of your church. Be aware that will either take a long time for the Mormon directee, and I'm talking about in terms of spiritual direction as well as pastoral care, to build a trust in you. Or the flip side is that they'll too quickly project and place naive trust in you. So it could go one way or the other. And they'll ask you, and don't be caught in the seduction of answering all of their questions. Because right now, to move them out of that place of spiritual dependence, which allowed spiritual abuse to occur, the encouragement needs, you need to offer the encouragement to think about these things and let it, there is no right answer, and that's really important. There's no right answer that you're leading them to. You're leading them to freedom. There may be some fear and resistance in accepting and naming their experience, because, you know, they're worried, you know, a little bit paranoid. Give them time, don't rush things, and listen and sincerely and carefully. Okay, we can go ahead. Sorry, rush that. How much time do we have, Anne? Oh, Anne's gone.
Sorry, no, I'm not sleeping. I was trying to find the unmute. Thank you. You have about 12 minutes before you want to take questions.
All right. So, is it okay if I offer this blessing? I feel like this has gone really, really quickly, but I want to praise emptiness and that bardo space, that liminality between the crashing, the depth between deconstruction and reconstruction, because reconstruction will happen even if you are in emptiness. You know, through eons of time, people have noticed. Was that John of the Cross? He talks about what is it, Katie? John of the Cross.
The dark night of the soul.
The dark night of the soul. Like, and this is an immensely productive, spiritually productive moment to wake up each morning and say, I don't know what I'm living for anymore. Immensely productive to notice the absence. That, but I will say that if this goes on, you're probably depressed, go see a clinician, right? So, you know, if you're kind of feeling there's some momentum in this sort of darkness, then that's probably healthy. But anyway, John O'Donoghue has been an incredibly important mentor. He's passed away now, but he's been an important teacher to me. Offers this prayer, which suggests that this moment of spiritual recovery from spiritual abuse is profoundly productive. It's pregnant with hope. So let me just read that. A blessing for new beginnings. And out of the way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander. This beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you were ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the grey promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight, when your courage kindled and out you stepped onto new ground. Your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back, learn to find ease and risk, and soon you'll be home in a new rhythm. For your soul senses the world that awaits you.
Beautiful. Mm.
Over to you, Katie.
Yeah, well, we'd love to take some questions now.
All right. So the first question, how can a situation be mitigated politely when our child comes home from a church activity and announces that he wants to die now so that he can see God because God is so awesome?
Katie, that's your question.
I think my instinct would be to reframe that a little and maybe try to gently deliteralize a little bit and ask, you know, where do you think you see God in this life? Where, you know, what's awesome if they, you know, if they use the word awesome, what's awesome here and now? And you don't have to go to the next life to see God, right? God's presence is here. And help them begin to name the awesome. And if they're young and they're able to put, you know, God, the word God, the name God to awesome things instead of shitty things, that's a win. That's a big win.
Okay, the next question. I feel that mainstream LDS church does a great job for children and people new to the church. How have you navigated teaching your children to accept God, yet not fall into the traps of orthodoxy so they don't suffer pastoral abuse?
I'll grab this one. I have 6 boys, and they're all on their own faith journeys. And I don't think, I mean, the statement here was, how have you navigated teaching your children to accept God? I haven't. I think particularly for young children, God is a very abstract notion, as it should be. And I like what Katie says about finding wonder and joy in relationship and in the environment. I think children respond best to that. I mean, I would like them to be able to find to have a spiritually rich life. But I think that's for me to see how I can support where that journey is going. I don't have any end notion of where they'll end up. And I think, you know, as a Mormon mum, when I was, you know, grew up and socialized to have a fixed notion about what my kids should be doing with their life in order to check off the I'm a good mum checklist. That's something I've had to let go. And I've felt infinitely more comfortable and relaxed in allowing my children to ask any question. The other day, one of our 15-year-olds, we have two 15-year-olds, and one of them said, I don't think I believe in God anymore. But he takes off to the church. He's a church intern, so he takes off to the church and does all the stuff more than everybody else. But, you know, that was just me noticing and not panicking, and letting him get rid of whatever notion that he had. And I celebrate that. Like, if my children, I want to talk about God, if they're really, you know, upset about the church or whatever it is, and then they've never been, except for the LDS church. It's a different story. But yeah, just kind of go notice where their particular inclinations. I think one of my kids is probably going to be a Buddhist. Another one is, you know, the couple probably be agnostic. You know, one of them is particularly curious about the community of Christ. So, you know, we just notice, you know, help them along that journey. So not to be fixed into anything is really important.
And I want to challenge the assumption embedded in the question just really quickly, which is, you know, what do we do to help our kids find God. And what if we don't help our kids find God, but God finds our kids?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not us. It's God who reaches out.
Or the divine, if you
God.
like that word.
Or right, but they use the word God of the question, so that's why I'm using it.
Gorgeous.
Other questions?
Okay, the next one is really just a comment. It says, what struck me was his awareness. I believe this refers to when you were reading your scripture.
Yeah.
And it says, she didn't touch him, only his cloak. Those loose garments, or those are loose garments, and I wonder if he was so aware that he felt the presence of her even in the busy street.
A nice
I thought
thought.
that was, yeah, I thought that was
Beautiful.
nice.
Thank you.
Gorgeous.
So I'm probably going to not say this right, just warning you. It says and is it Letico? Is that how you say it?
Uh-huh.
Letico Divina verses. Katie believes the story is literal. Gina does not. If literal, the story is accurate reporting. If not literal, the story teaches about a real human need. Do you have any comments?
I responded to Steve. I said, I think either way, it can definitely be understood as teaching and responding to a human need.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
so I want to clarify a little bit. I think that in the kind of fundamentalist modernist sort of debates that happen, of which Mormonism has been kind of brought in, there's a question of if the literality of the story is the most important thing, and it's not. I believe all of Scripture to be theopoetic. So I believe that the Jesus event happened. I don't have a, what's the word, a sort of concrete notion of what that necessarily means. So that God heals, that Jesus, is the presence of healing. Yes, I believe that in a really tangible way, that's a really tangible thing. But I'm not worried about the historicity so much. I hope that.
Right. Yeah.
That just further obscures the question. I think a lot of times folks get just caught up in it. Either has to be literal or it has to be metaphorical. What if it's beautiful? What if it's poetry? What if it's art?
Nice.
That was very well answered, I think. The next two are just some comments. We really don't have any other questions here. Do you want me to read those, or do you have something
Go ahead.
else?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so the first comment says, I have OCD, and the church's practice of thought control and absolute authority impacted my ability to cope with my condition. I recognize my spiritual leaders didn't cause my condition, but I wish leaders would take greater accountability for how their teachings impact all their parishioners and not just the psychopaths.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that has a lot to do with the lack of training. Once again, there's that magical worldview that as soon as you receive the mantle of a calling, you're going to be changed by that calling. And I think to a certain degree, of course, you will. But it doesn't make those interview situations a matter of magic. Like, there are things that one ought to just know about humanity and our different conditions and our different dispositions, particularly in such an important role as offering pastoral care and church leadership. I think that's where the LDS Church really fails immensely. And it can do a huge mischief. It can do really good things, but it also can do a huge mischief.
So that actually got me thinking, may I ask a question on the go here? So, do you think that because the LDS Church is typically, lay men who are fulfilling these callings of leadership positions, and they haven't been through a lot of education with some of this stuff, that can be a cause of where some of these things are impacting the behavior and how they treat their parishioners?
Oh, absolutely. I'll just say this one thing really quickly, Katie. When Community of Christ, which was on a similar as the RLDS church was on a similar trajectory, they decided, I think it was in the 60s and 70s, and I think Robin is here, she might, I don't know how she can tell us either way, but anyway, they decided they actually needed to get some seminary training, and so they went, I think they went to theology school, and it was at that point they realized what, some of the liberties that they had taken with people's belief systems and reeled that back in. And I think that has made a much more healthy religious context. But certainly, certainly, I think that it really lets people down without exegetical, hermeneutical understanding of scripture, without pastoral care training. But you know what? Church leaders aren't there for pastoral care and helping people ease into their spiritual journey. It's about reproduction, about reproducing the system. So that sounds very cynical, but I can't see it as any other way, really.
Yeah,
I think they do it in a loving way, a loving reproduction of the system. Sometimes.
I don't know. I sometimes push back on the notion that it's done in a loving way. I think it's done in a well-intentioned way, in that they're not meaning to ruin people's lives and their relationships with God. But I don't think it's actually love, right? Because it's a distorted notion of love. But love gives freedom and space.
Yeah. I love that you say that, because we're going to end now with the point, which is, however much you want to do pastoral care, you need to undergird that with the question of freedom. And how can you offer the spiritually abused freedom and space?
Yes, agreed.
Is that it? I found this really kind of cool, but weird. Like there's like
I think other questions? Does anything else come up in the chat or anything like that?
Somebody mentions Marlene Winnell's work on religious trauma syndrome. I think that's really useful work.
Oh, yeah.
Spiritual and toxic religion. I think there's Ken Roth and the Blue Guy and the Vander something guy. There's quite a bit of literature. And don't be afraid to look outside of the LDS Church for resources. And someone asked what aspects of Mormon theology may provide handicaps to LDS ecclesiastical, sorry, I'm not laughing at the question, ecclesiastical leaders as they attempt to provide pastoral care. And I think I like Roy Otterson's response, so have a look on there. She says the first thing that comes to mind is the narrative that there is only one true church. That makes honouring other spiritual paths hard, although I believe it is our theology that God is in all things, in all places, including our churches. So I think that could be unpacked. But yes, certainly.
For me, it's the idea of worthiness as something that can be earned or that can be achieved through a checklist, right? As opposed to a spacious understanding of grace, and that we are loved and accepted, as we are. That doesn't mean that, if we have hurt someone, or if we're complicit in systems of oppression, or blah, 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 it doesn't mean that there's no room for growth or improvement. But the difference is the logic. So sort of the LDS logic is if then, if I do this, then God does this. And I think a gracious logic reverses that and says, because therefore, because I'm loved, because I'm whole, because I'm accepted, I can love, serve, apologize, grow, change. And I think that LDS teaching is very if-then driven, which I think is really damaging.
Oh, can I just address this final question? I think this could be a final one, Katie. How does one begin to find good pastoral care? I think that's a really good question. I think it takes some hunting around. I don't think there's for the right kind of pastoral care. You might want to say, look, I'm a former Mormon, and just test it out. But also, so you could go to different parishes or different churches and look for the vicar or the priest or whatever it is. And test their fluency with your crisis. But also you could seek out a spiritual director And spiritual directors are not clergy necessarily, and they should have been trained. And you can, I think the website is Spiritual Directors International, and you can find local spiritual directors, but always test it out, test the chemistry out, and you can say no. Yes, you can say no. Mormons, say no.
Yeah, you can.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, ascending forth. I just thank you for being here and wish you hope and healing and grace and peace and goodness. Yeah, that's what I got. Gina, do you have any sending forth words?
No, I don't have any. Just go in the name of Christ. That's the Anglican in me.
Go in peace.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you. We would like to encourage you that if you do have questions, you can reach out to Gina and Katie on the Whova app and connect with them there. We would like to thank you for attending and for supporting Sunstone, and we'll see you at the next session.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Katie.
Bye.
Thank you both. You were great.
Thanks.
See ya.